Hello, welcome everyone to another episode of Build It and They Will Come in the Akhund Forbes podcast series. Today we have a very unique guest. Usually we've spoken to and had conversations with business leaders who are there building their businesses. But today we're talking about a very unique kind of building, a very unique kind of making, and that is aesthetic making. My guest today is one of the leading artists in Pakistan. She spends her time between Pakistan and Sri Lanka. She's a graduate of the National College of Arts, and she went on to attain her doctorate from Oxford University. She has regularly been commissioned by international art biennales, most recently in Istanbul 2022, and she has an exhibition opening coming up in Qatar as well. I'm delighted to welcome you, Dr. Mariah Lookman. So glad to have you here with us.
Nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
No, it's a pleasure. I should also add that you are a tutor and a curator, and we met during the MPhil course at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture.
That's right.
So thank you for being here. In a way, you are the quintessential regional post-colonial artist, right? You spend your time between Sri Lanka and Pakistan.
Yes.
You were educated here in Pakistan and then to Oxford, and then in Oxford. How have those sort of very fundamental and you grew up in a community, a Bora community, right? Which had come from India, had actually moved to Bangladesh, Chittagong, and then it came to Pakistan.
No, actually, the Bora community is more complex than that in their geography. There are some families that are intrinsically from Karachi and Mandvi and Kutch, which falls more towards Sindh. And so they were the old families of Karachi. My background is not that. My background is from actually Calcutta from my mother's side, right? And Bombay from my father's side. And that's where my parents were born. So, and it's not a 1947 story either. My parents moved or met, during the fall of Dhaka.
Okay. I see. Okay. During the fall of Dhaka in 1971.
1971. And on my grandmother's side, Dadi's side, she had brothers who were doing business between Bombay and Karachi. And which is why my father ended up here.
I see. And then
the story goes on. Yes.
So, but and those experiences, right? Those family experiences, and then growing up in Karachi, going to Lahore, NCA, and then going to Oxford, how have they shaped the kind of work that you do? And perhaps you can tell us a bit about the kind of work that you do, because you started off being a fine arts painter, and then you moved now to visual arts, movies, and then moving. Image. How have your fundamental experiences shaped the work that you do, or are going to do?
There's in between Oxford and National College of Arts, I was at the Slade School of Fine Art in London. And quite part way at NCA, my tutor was Lala Rukh. And I was like, Lala, I just can't hang around in the studio. I feel a bit claustrophobic. I need to go out. And I need to take photographs. And at that point, photography was not offered as a standard course that you could take as a person who's enrolled in the painting program. And she said, well, let me do something, maybe you could. And that's how I started to make my forays into the darkroom. And so I would work in the darkroom at NCA, which is a third or fourth floor above the design department. And it was magical because the assistant, his name was a technician who taught me a lot, Munir. I was like, how the hell can he see in the dark? Like, how is he doing all of this? But I was hooked. And in fact, even at NCA, I started to work in video.
I see. The course that you were teaching at IVS was about regional themes.
Yes.
Right? Regional themes in art, and the influences of the colonial past on this particular region, right, of South Asia, predominantly South Asia. Is your work also an exploration of those regional themes, or would you say, look, by design, every artist is sort of working within, in his own sort of space and context, and a priori context, if we can use concepts. But how does that impact your work?
Well, so there was a time when there were a lot more people like me who could say, my father was born in Bombay, my mother was born in Calcutta, I spent my childhood in Chittagong, I was here, I was there, now I live in Sri Lanka, I feel South Asian. I think in the 80s, 90s, right, and especially in the 90s and the 2000s, which was my sort of academic time or student time, it was all about identity, questioning the idea of the nation, talking politics. 9/11 had happened, right? So there was this whole idea of a Muslim woman, right? Whereas as a student at NCA, we'd already been part of this idea that, what the Taliban are doing and the way they're restricting women's access to education has no connection to Islam, right? And then you suddenly have, personalities like Cherie Blair who start talking about, the Akhund woman and the girl child, etc. And then you had this sort of conversation on one hand, and the other one was like, oh, it's the tribal culture and custom. And I used to be in England at that time, and you always had the mic thrust upon you. So what do you think? And I was like, I don't think any of this.
Yeah.
Right? Because
this doesn't take mental space.
No, it is not my reality.
It's not your reality.
It's not my reality, and neither am I here and like this because this is where I found my freedom. I had my freedom.
Yeah.
I come from this, and I'm not alone here, right? So that was quite disturbing, and that had a lot of unlearning and questioning, because I used to move quite fluidly between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then later on Sri Lanka. Forever I can mimic the accent.
Yeah.
In India, I can become person from Bombay. My Bengali is not so good anymore, but I can get away.
You can get away.
I can get away in Gujarati. I can get away. I can pretend I'm absolutely local. And I started to pay attention to that a lot more. Things I used to take for granted. And I think that's coming back to the idea of the region. I was like, oh, I am the region, and how do you unpack this?
Yeah.
What are the questions? So they're not limited to, limited in a scope to the current boundaries of Pakistan or city or, and then, you just, you use humor, you start, you have different kinds of friendships. So, I have Indian friends who I say, well, everything that India is actually is in Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
Because it's the Indus Valley civilization, that's how you get your name. So actually India is in Pakistan. So just those kind of provocations, things were jokes, some things became serious, some things became work, some things didn't.
Yeah. How was your experience going to the Slade first and then to Oxford? And apart from the mic being thrust in you and sort of you having to sort of answer those questions, but how was that experience generally for you as an artist?
So at Slade, the teaching is really, really well. What's common between both the Ruskin and the Slade is that it's quite hands-on, and I'd learned a lot about painting. I'd learned a lot about many things I knew. I mean, I know how to take a photograph, I know how to develop, but there were many things I didn't know. And at Slade, I think I enrolled in every possible course that I could to do with filmmaking, right? Whether it was making films by hand, using cameras, using lights, using, early programs or Photoshop, Adobe Premiere, they were a bit different, but the blueprint was the same as we have today. And so I was doing a lot of that non-stop. And then I thought, this is really boring, that somehow practice was not just enough. Because I had enrolled in the MFA because I didn't know any better. And then I had a friend who said, oh, there's such a thing called the MA that you could also do at the Slade.
Okay.
And I'm like, what's that? And so, oh, it's a hybrid between art history, philosophy, and practice. So you get to do both, but the course is longer. It takes about minimum 24 calendar months, right? So it's about 2.5 years as opposed to 18 months. So I was like, okay, does it cost more? Like, no, it's the same price. I'm like, okay. That's an idea.
You switched from the MFA to the MA.
It was not so straightforward. I had a tutor. His name was, he's wonderful. He's one of the lead, he's Stuart Priestley. He's a performance artist. He works in performance, film, video, and photography. And Stuart said, well, if you need to do that, there are these other things you need to do, fulfill the criteria to be enrolled in that. But if you can, then sure, you can switch. And I was like, okay, fine, Stuart, I'll do that. What do I have to do? You have to write this essay. You have to submit it by this time, that time. I'm like, okay, let's do it. And then he said, if you want, I can read it beforehand and I can tell you whether you'll make it or not. And then I thought, if I tell him and then he'll tell me you can or can't, then I wouldn't have done it on my own. So let's just do it.
Yeah.
Right? But Stuart said one thing, and he taught me a lot about Britain and system and politics. He said, there will be those who won't want you to switch. And the card they will use is, oh, she's missed too many days of X, Y, Z class. So you just make sure you know everyone who is taking a class and you make yourself known in class. Because they can't tell you, you can't attend my class.
Yeah.
Right? So I would just go, hello, may I sit in your class? This is me. We're like, okay. And then that's it. I got in. The rest is in the past. Yeah.
Yeah. And you felt that moving away from just pure practice was more beneficial to the kind of thing that you wanted to do.
It was what I didn't have.
Okay.
Right? Reading that kind of philosophy, looking at art history and combine it with philosophy and asking all these questions, whether it was from social science, whether it was from political science, whether it was from aesthetic theory, whether it was continental philosophy, whether it was about language, about identity, whether it is Said or Foucault or whoever, right? Deleuze and Guattari to Khalid.
Yeah, to Rancière or to whoever. And that's a very interesting thing, right? Because I certainly wasn't aware of this until the MPhil, which is, as an artist, it's not just practice. It is understanding the context in which you're working. And that does take into account all the things from cultural theory to political theory to art history to aesthetic theory. And all of that has to, particularly in modern art, has to speak through your work, or your work has to address at some level. You have to try and address those things in the work that you're doing. So what are you doing right now? Or actually, let's first start. Let's start with the Biennale in Istanbul.
But before we go there, so practice is enough, right? But the problem is that the education standards have gone down tremendously, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on the STEM subjects, but as part of your normal schoolwork, you don't really do enough reading of philosophy or history or all of that, right?
You don't.
Which a lot of the European schooling does give, right? So when your schooling is not as robust as it should be, then you enter an art school, right? So there is a difference between artists of the past because they were fluent in reading, writing.
I see. So they had the skills and the tools to actually go explore that on their own.
They could, right? Because they did have a strong background. But because the schooling system has deteriorated so much with a lot of emphasis on like STEM subjects and tuitions and A stars, that your kind of well-rounded education, where you naturally reading literature and remembering some poetry and being part of that. So So that's also a bigger problem.
Of course, absolutely, yes. And you feel that in Pakistan, even amongst the very top schools, even the good schools, that is lacking. So when you at Indus, when you get students who are coming in fresh out of school, you feel that difference now amongst those students?
You feel it more for people who come from more privileged schooling systems. You feel it a bit more.
Indeed. Okay, that's interesting.
Because people who don't come from privileged backgrounds, there's something they have. So they've worked at it anyway.
Yeah. And at least they've reflected upon it.
Right? So they make a lot of effort.
Yes.
But those who just take things for granted, ki, this is it and this is the best, they have not really asked that many questions, right?
Yes, yes.
Unless they come from a home which is pushing them to ask these questions.
Yeah.
So there's a stark difference.
Indeed. And so let's talk about a little bit about your work. Istanbul Biennale 2022.
Right.
It was, would you like to describe that work, and then we can talk a little bit about it?
So this was my first sort of foray into moving out of a studio space and into the landscape, right? But also reshaping the landscape. The commission came to me, and I had done not a similar, but I had been interviewed because I'd been unwell, and it was during COVID, and health was on the forefront of everyone's concern, right? What are we doing?
Yeah.
Health of the planet, disease, germs, illness, etc. And from the window of my studio in Gaul, we're not far from this small hill, mountain, called Rumasala, right? And it has a microclimate. And the story goes from the Ramayana that Sita was held captive, right?
By Ravana.
By Ravana,
Yes.
who was the king of Lanka.
Yes.
And that was one of the areas. And during the battle, when Lakshman...
And Hanuman rescued.
When Lakshman was very terribly injured, right? He inflicted a huge wound, and he was going to almost die. And then Rama would have lost the war.
Yeah.
Sage comes, and a doctor is consulted, and he says, well, you need to go to this. You need to get the Sanjeevani booty.
I see.
And where does it grow? It grows in Himalayas. It's like, okay, who's going to go? Hanuman says, I'm going to go. And he goes, and then he's like, I don't know which one this is. So Hanuman, being Hanuman, becomes an even bigger giant because his shape and size shifts. And he just picks up a chunk of mountain, and he flies back from the Himalayas to Sri Lanka.
I see.
And chunks of mountain fall on his journey back. Right? And there are 4 or 5 different parts in Sri Lanka where the chunks of these mountains fell, and they are still mountains. They have a microclimate, and all sorts of herbs and medicinal plants grow there, which do not grow elsewhere. And then you can find a connection to them in parts of the Kashmir Valley, right? So
I see.
So when I was offered this, I worked with this incredible filmmaker. His name is Amar Kanwar. Amar is Indian. He lives in Delhi. And I got a phone call from Amar, and I thought Amar was just going to call me to say, hey, how are you? And he's like, yes, I called for that too, but how about Istanbul? And I said, okay, what about Istanbul? And he said, well, if you'd like to do something, then you're invited, but on one condition, and it has to be meaningful. I was like, okay, that's really Amar. He says, like, don't do it just because you can or you've been invited. I won't mind if you refuse. It's just like, okay, fine. And then, I knew where I was in terms of my geography and the stories. And so I proposed to create, I couldn't quite do what I wanted to do. We didn't have the budget. But I wanted to create like a medicinal plants garden, right? Which would be in a greenhouse, which would be a mirror of paradise. So seasons and weathers change all around, but here it's always paradise, because that's what the idea of paradise is.
Indeed.
It's never cold, it's never hot, it's
perfect.
always, perfect for living. Fruit, flowers, everything grows all the time, right? So that's paradise. And a greenhouse can do that. And Istanbul would have worked because it has 4 seasons, it has snow, etc. So,
and this garden was a reflection of
these ideas. Right? And so, I was like, Istanbul is quite concrete and built up. Where do you think this is?
Yes.
And I said, oh yes, good point. Where is this? And, it's brilliant. He's like, so where is it? Is it near a school? Is it near the airport? Is it near a hospital? Where is this? Who's going to go there? So I started making this. I said, no, it should be near hospitals, because it can create solace, because people have really horrible places, to hang around when they're waiting for somebody who's unwell, or even if somebody's unwell, going to the hospital, immediately get unwell.
Yeah.
So how about it have all these things? And I said, hospital, medical schools, universities, going from here to there, so you can, you have a change of experience getting A to B. And they started writing all of that. Okay? And the incredible team at Istanbul, they literally fed in those coordinates, and they came up with an area which Google Maps helped them locate. And what the Istanbul team, who know tremendous everything about Istanbul, they didn't know that about more than 20 years now ago, a group of plant scientists and indigenous medicine specialists had rescued, right? So Istanbul is a land of cemeteries, graves, walls, mosques, churches, lots of roads, and then under, in the past 20 years, lots and lots of concrete big projects, right? Whether they are malls or whether this and that. And when even parts of the cemetery, when a graveyard is like too old or whatever, they're just like, oh, let's make something into this, and we can develop it into a mall, we can do something. And so very cleverly, these, specialists decided to save about 6-7 acres, I think it's about that much, could be less, from this kind of development, right? And they converted into a medicinal plants garden to use it as a teaching facility. In the neighborhood are like all these medical colleges. In the neighborhood are all these old hospitals. In this neighborhood are the oldest cemeteries, because it's just on the other side of the Roman wall.
I see.
Right. And so there's a Muslim end, there is a Christian end, there is multiple Syriac end, there is you have Armenian, you have sort of multiple denominations, so you have all kinds. And then there was a section for the fallen, unmarked. Right, and that's why they wanted to do the development, because the rest of it was
fallen unmarked from the two wars, the First World War, Second World War, or
Istanbul. Anything
throughout,
can be from the Romans to the Byzantine to the whoever. The stories are endless, right? But the thing is that this is where the fallen, unwanted, unclaimed. Right?
So the hospital and the garden in this area, the fallen, the unclaimed.
Right. So the lead of this, if I'm not mistaken, is a gentleman called Dr. Murad. There are lots of Murads, of course, in Istanbul, but Dr. Murad Bey, he was one of the leading figures who negotiated with the government, etc., to let this be real teaching enterprise.
Yeah.
And so, I was asked, would you like to go and see? And I said, yes, of course, I'd like to go and see. So the garden has a wonderful team. They're very knowledgeable. They have a library. They have a seed bank. They do things. There are classes that take place. But it was a little bit neglected in the sense that from the cultural community as such. Because the neighborhood is a lot of people who've come from Syria, from even China, because there's all sorts of Iraqi. There's especially a lot of Muslim Russian, Cossack people. So the mix is kind of a transient migrant, working blue collar neighborhood. And so it was not quite on the cultural map in that sense. So hence, the garden, they had the space, they had everything, but there was this neglect. And so they welcomed the project, and then they gave us space. And when I got to the site, you see, what I didn't know. So I said, okay, we want to make something in a garden, right? So they said, now we found you a place which already has medicinal plants garden. So how do you respond to that? What do you bring in? All that aside, I had said that in Sri Lanka, we don't have music in the same way as we do in a country like Turkey, for example, right? Crossroads of East and West, the enormous varieties of instruments. I said, we need to record something. And they said, okay. And said, okay, what do you want? So so initially it was mistakenly I thought music in a kind of a medicalized setting. No, I don't mean it in a medicalized setting. I mean it in a kind of a wellness setting, and not this modern kind of medicalized way. And they're like, okay. And we started to interview people. And I started listening. I got a lot of recordings. And then I picked one out of that. And by listening, okay?
Yeah.
And I kept saying, I want people who play old instruments. I don't want any new instrument. They're like, what do you mean by old? The age of the instrument or like the old? I said
traditional instruments.
Age and old. Okay? Like, okay. And I was connected with this wonderful cheng player, which is like a harp. But if you call it harp, you get a slap on your wrist for like really not knowing the difference. And so I collaborated with this wonderful woman called Kanike. And then Kanike tells me she's the daughter of, a very important teacher who used music for healing, and he revived, so in Turkey, they have a long 800-year tradition of using music for healing, especially mental health and all kinds of things. And that was it. I was hooked. They were hooked. So we did multiple things. So we realized that this was really big in terms of creating a climate control, building all this. Like, okay, what's the most important part of this? So the water, right? Because the garden did not have a water feature. Okay. They had this tiny little fountain, the kind of colonial type of fountain.
Yeah,
three-tier
a water spout.
Water spout kind of thing. And it didn't really work. And they're like, we don't know what this is. We don't like it. So I said, well, could we have this space? They were like, okay. But people have not succeeded really in doing successful water gardens in Istanbul because of this, that, and the other. You know, I said, "Chalo, kar lete," you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it was trust building, and of course, the economic crisis in Turkey continue. So every time you get a quotation, it's different in the morning, it's different in the evening, it's different next morning, right? So 3 times a day they revise the kind of quotations that are possible. And Kanike said, you know, my husband, you know, he does all kinds of things. He's a sculptor, he's a gardener. And I'm like, really? Sartaj, he can do all of this? Yes. And so it just started to come together. And they all are actually musicians, healers. They have this other group called Tumata. And it's a whole group of people who don't think of the idea of being Turkish means the Turkey of today, right? It goes all the way to Mongolia.
I see.
Actually,
the Turkish empire, you can call it, or the conquest, where were the
culturally,
Turkish culturally,
okay,
right?
and through music,
through the language, the Turkic language, so to speak, in a way,
and varieties of it, right? So all the way
even
to Mongolia,
Central Asia, Kazakhstan, all of that.
So you know their stories and the songs they were singing go all the way to Mongolia.
Absolutely, they do.
Right, and so it's like people who go to the bazaar and they sing the song, and the China, all the way, right? So it was like magic.
Yeah,
it was like magic to be. I remember I went with the director of the Istanbul Biennial, Bige, and I, you know, he said we'll go to Kaniki's house, and just to listen, to have a jam, right? And we were there, and then they started playing. And within a few minutes, right, we were just crying. We don't know what happened. It was abstract, right? But there is this ability in music to do things, which can cause a catharsis, which can, you know, which can create a change.
A sublime experience.
But also a systemic change from within, right? And then I found out that in traditional Turkish medicine, there is no concept of hospital, right? Which is a completely different idea. And they have an idea of, it's called Shifakhana.
Yeah, it's a wellness center.
Exactly. Yes. And in the vicinity, because it's Istanbul, right? So you just have to kind of look a little bit and then, you know, things start showing up. This whole area, it's called Markez Effendi. Markez Effendi was a saint, you know, again, operating in the 13th, 14th century, pioneered oral hygiene and mental health, right? And his school and his, you know, his tomb and, you know, his place of burial and his followers, the cemetery of the followers was just around the corner. Round the corner to that was also one of the oldest Mevlihanas in Istanbul, which under the Ataturk regime had been converted into a storage house. And so that Mevlihana, you know, where the whirling dervish kind of, you know, that's there.
That's where they...
So that was just around the corner. Then they had another school where they were doing calligraphy around the corner. And then, you know, it was cemeteries, art, music, and everything was within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Came together. The whole thing was just
and
an
just
ideal
at the shadow of the, you know, Roman wall.
Yeah.
So, you know, time and stories were just endless.
Yes.
And I added the Ramayana to it.
Wonderful. When you're making a work, right, and the sense of the artist trying to influence the other, right?
It was scary in a way, you know, because as we were coming close to completion, so I did a film, I wrote a script, we put the music, we made an album. We create this water body which is round with a floating lotus deck where performance could take place. It was, covered in marble. Why marble? Because all the tombstones are in marble, right? And I said I don't want to import anything which is out of. And they're like, oh, we use the marmara. Like, okay, the white, perfect. And so, there was to be a performance.
Yes.
Thing. And then said, okay, we're going to do the opening here. We'll open the biennial with this.
So it was the opening of the biennial. I didn't know that. Okay.
So it all opened with a performance. The opening of the biennial was on my piece. So, how was it received? It was
wonderful. That's
very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Because you had the Austrian and the German radios that were like, no, but like, what do you think about the regime which doesn't let you talk about things and politics? So I was like, but what about the pharmaceutical companies that have robbed you all during COVID, right? So, it's easy to sort of, politics are much more complicated than just saying evil man,
absolutely.
good guy, bad. It's layered and it's far more complex than that.
It's multi-layered, it's multifaceted, and there are no easy answers, right?
No. And I think that's what art does.
Yes.
It tells you that do not jump to conclusions in haste. Slows down. You try and slow things down a bit.
Yeah. Unpack them. As you say. Yeah. Unpack them, slow down, and sort of see a different way.
Reflect.
And reflect. Yeah.
Just slow down.
When you're making, when you're building, this is what you want to achieve as the objective of your art, is to make people reflect, unpack, slow down, understand, and question. Is that going through your mind when you're making that?
See, I think that becomes embodied.
It's part of the process.
It's part of the process, right? If you think too much about it, then it would all be very contrived.
Of course.
And staged, right? So I think one of the harder things, going back to some of the earlier things you were asking, that, how do you process from being in Lahore to going to England to study, and finally, at the doctorate level, what's this journey? I think it took a long time to just forget about everything I had learned, right? But believe that it was in me, right? And it's like driving. If you keep thinking of all the rules, you'll never get anywhere. Well, riding a bicycle or driving or any of swimming, right? You can't think.
Yeah. You just make it part of your muscle memory. You just make it part of who you are.
Your brain, thinking, muscle, hand, right? That's why you sketch all the time, because it becomes part of that memory, right? Dancers have to practice every day. You need to read regularly, right? Otherwise you lose your stamina. You'll fall asleep after 50 words or something. Right? And just things like that.
Yeah. That's incredible, because this is, we've had guests before and they've talked about this way of, it could be client service, it could be the way they run their business, or the way they manage. And it becomes part, the process
Second
becomes
nature.
Second nature, exactly.
Right.
And it's interesting for you to say that about the process of art making, being an artist. And all of these influences become very much part of you and who you are, and that's how the work comes out. That's interesting.
Because you that's a sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Right? Then it's about like, I want to do that.
Yes.
I think it should look like this. This is the reason. Wait, where did I read that? Why am I thinking this? So
exactly.
It's the more fun part then.
Yeah.
Because you are pushing yourself to think through the work. Right? And then that becomes hopefully communicated. Yes.
Because
You can't be prescriptive.
You're right.
And then if everything is really easy, then you also don't have magic.
Agreed. Absolutely.
And if you don't have magic and things that don't make any sense, then what's the point? So if everything is answered and there's no magic and everything is explained and analyzed, and very rarely, it holds the magic.
And the other thing is that you don't know, because every viewer who comes into an exhibition brings themselves, their history, their perspective, to that.
Yes.
And in a way, the work changes with each viewer's history, with each viewer sort of bringing himself to bear upon that work.
And time changes things.
And time changes things as well, right? And therefore, one work that was perhaps 50 years ago could be viewed differently today with a different history, and the history of the artist, the history of the times, the context of the place, and the context of the viewer.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's ever evolving that way.
It evolves, and people are forever reassessing.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
In some ways, people who, there's a lot of fall from grace in some cases.
Yeah.
And then in other instances, there's we overlook this. So there are these two extremes, right? But then at the same time, there are artists who could be forgotten. And then you're like, oh, actually, this is a really important artist we need to look at.
Yeah.
Or we've only looked at this and we haven't looked at that.
Yeah.
And that was never understood, but now it just makes absolute sense.
Yes.
Because, right?
Yeah. And so, and the work that is going to be shown in Qatar, should we talk about that a little bit?
Okay.
It's part of a exhibition, a survey of Pakistani art.
That's right.
Right. It's at the Qatar Museum.
Mm-hmm.
It's been commissioned by it, and you have a piece in it. It's again multimedia, and it talks about Sadiqain, right? Or it relates to Sadiqain and his works and his place in Pakistani art. And Sadiqain was one of the greatest artists.
Yeah, he was a quintessentially Pakistani
artist back in the 60s and the 70s. He died in 1987.
Correct.
But he wasn't born in Pakistan. He was born in India. Right?
He was born in Amroha.
Amroha. Please tell us about that work.
Okay, so
and the reason I mentioned he was born in India is because part of what you're exploring in this work is how that influence of coming from India has impacted his work and tradition generally.
So, Sadiqain is born in the 1930s in Amroha, in India, in Uttar Pradesh, right? And he comes from a kind of Awadhi culture in the shadow of Awadh, Urdu speaking, right? Very literary. Aligarh is here, there is all this idea of what is it to be cultured, right? And so it requires you to have a grasp on poetry and language and
from Persian to Hindi, to Sanskrit, to Arabic, to Urdu, to English. Yeah.
Right, and be totally immersed in understanding where you are.
Yes.
Right, with Hinduism, with the idea of multiple ways of finding out what we're doing here. Right, so whether you go for a Shiva temple, or you go to a Durga Puja, or you go to the shrine, right, or some awliya, the questions are the same, right? So he belonged to that kind of culture. And then post 1947, he moves over to Pakistan. And then here again, as writers like Wazir Zamindar, for example, say partition was not just, okay, now we have a border and done deal.
Yeah.
Right? It was a whole process of people moving, people choosing, right? Yeah. For example, even Salman Rushdie says his uncles were here and he was like, oh, I don't know, I'll come and check it out. No, I don't think so. I'm better in Bombay, right? As it was then, Mumbai. So there's a lot of that. My father's brother was like telling my father, are you mad? What are you doing in Karachi? Yeah. I'm fine in Bombay, right? My father's circumstances were different, but again, this is a story which you find mirrored in many, many families.
Indeed.
I'm not sure exactly what the details are of Sadiq Khan's family. But, you know, he does have family in India. So obviously people decided not to move and people decided to move, right? And then in about 2016 perhaps, or 14, probably 15, 16, I was given like this film tin which said Sadiq Khan on top of it. And I was like, oh. Anyway, it was glued, stuck together, damaged.
Yeah.
And we couldn't do much to it. And I was told to go, you know, chuck it in the dustbin, you know, iska kuch nahi ho sakta. It was all like sticky and smelly and all of that. And I thought, okay, well, you know, there was something in me which didn't want to let go. Right? And I was like, so this is 9 years ago. And I was just like, no, wait, hang on. Let's just, you know, I was in London then, and I called a dear friend of mine who's an incredible filmmaker, Alia Sayed. Alia is British, Pakistani. And Alia said, could I come around? And he said, yeah, come around. And I said, Alia, look, okay, let's just like open it up and we can hang it. And we just had, you know, meters and meters of film hanging down her banister. And then what do we do? It's like, you can't do anything about it. It's not drying up because it's
all glued up.
It's really tacky, right? Whatever this is, it's really still tacky. I was like, okay. So I just thought, okay, I'll just cut it up. And then I thought, okay, let me just quickly scan it on my flatbed scanner, because it was all just destroying and changing and becoming weird continuously. And so I chopped it up. I was back in Sri Lanka. I scanned it. You know, whatever. I did it. And I put everything back in a box, and, you know, it just curled up, right? And there it sat in my studio again.
Okay.
You know?
All scanned. All recorded to the extent that you could.
Right? Whatever I had, you know, it had to be done really quickly. Whatever I had at hand, I said, chalo, isko aise kar lete hain, aise kar lete hain. Phir sochte. Right? And I had been to a conference at the Whitechapel Gallery. And Ali had made a film, right, where people think of the materiality of film as a medium. So what people do is record things and then they bury it, literally. And they forget about it for like X number of years and time, right? And then they pick it out again. And then they start viewing it and see what happens. What is the decay like? What happened, right? So I was like, I already have it. I have something. It is already dead.
Yeah.
From, you know, it was impossible to do anything with it. Anyway, I couldn't remember where the tin was. Anyway, I found it. And I have it with me here now in Karachi. And it's still sticky.
Okay.
It's still sticky. It's still curly. It's still a mess. So, and that was it. And I thought, okay, got to do something with it. And I called Hussain Naqvi, HM, as he's known. HM Naqvi.
Hussain being one of the great young authors, literary fiction authors to have come out of Pakistan.
That's right.
Yes. He's on his third book now.
Yes.
Yes.
And I said, Hussain, you know something? You just sound like Akbar Naqvi. And like, I sound like Akbar Chacha? I'm like, yes, you do.
Akbar Naqvi being Hussain's uncle.
Yes.
And
one of the pioneering authors on art
critics. Yeah.
He started out his career as somebody who wrote for the press, you know, from the Star to Dawn to Herald. And he did this seminal book called Image and Identity, which was a survey of Pakistani art for 50 years. And I had the fortune of meeting Akbar Naqvi when he was teaching at the National College of Arts, Lahore. That's when I started my teaching career. And we used to overlap.
Okay.
And we had become great friends. And I said, Hussain, you can be Akbar Naqvi's voice, and will you do this? And he's like, okay, it sounds like really weird, but absolutely fine. And I'd had this conversation many years ago, right? And then coming back to the Qatar Museum, they had asked me, okay, could you send your portfolio? And I said, yes, but I think I have something you should look at.
Okay.
Right? I have another idea. And I made the proposal. And they were like, oh. And I said, I've never had the occasion to finish this.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's such a weird idea, but it's so specific to Pakistan, right? And our history. And, for example, Saqib Hanif has an article which is like, Picasso of Pakistan.
Yeah.
Right? People have sort of dubbed him.
They've interpreted him in many different ways.
Right.
They've interpreted him as an Islamic artist or a pioneer of Islamic art in Pakistan, the Picasso of Pakistan, all those things. Yes.
Accused of obscenity, accused of wayward behavior,
yes.
Accused of being a fakir, accused of being a spiritualist, accused of being
two-faced. Yeah.
Two-faced, accused, of being many things,
Yes.
and he sort of embodied all of them, right? And
accepted them.
Accepted them, and also operated within these spheres, which is a task. I was listening to an interview by one of his relations about his trip to India. He got a visa for 3 days or something, and he had a meeting with Indira Gandhi.
Okay.
And Indira said, okay, how does it feel for you to come back? And Sadiq is said to have, I have a lot of work to do here, and you've just given me this ridiculous short visa.
Yeah.
Right? My idea is to make a mural here, the Banaras University. I need to do all these things, but you just haven't given me any opportunity or time. And Indira Gandhi looked at him and said, done. Grant him the time and support he needs to get whatever he needs to do. But to be able to do that to somebody who's the Iron Lady.
Yes. You had to be Sadiq.
Right? To operate with high society, street people, precedents, to be irreverent in the face of authority, authoritarianism. It's so you can never please everybody at the same time. But I think the complexity of him as a person is what is so attractive. Talent aside, right? Because in certain circles, what remains of artists like Sadiq is the dollar value, what's hanging on your wall.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right? But what else is there?
Yeah. And isn't that a problem with art? That in some ways, it ends up, or, for some people at least, in the public sphere, it ends up being the dollar value, right? And many of the people who are sort of hanging the art on their walls, they probably don't know all of this. And they don't think about, there's, and as an artist, it's probably difficult to say these things, right? Because, you do want dollar value to be ascribed to your art. And you do want to sort of make a living. You do want to make a good living out of it.
Absolutely.
But then how do you, and you can't control what the person who buys, that what he thinks about it, how he values it, etc. Is that a problem in your mind? Is that?
So if you take an example like Sadiq, right, how he navigates all of that.
His paintings now go for hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Right. So but how did he navigate all that?
How did he?
Right. And one could say that he himself lived, within himself. Right. So he wore his sherwani. He had his spectacles. He called himself the fakir. He slept on the floor. He didn't really care much. He supported all his family.
Yeah.
Right? And so he didn't suddenly turn up in a very expensive car or something like that. Right? Did he keep himself, untainted through those kinds of actions? I don't know. Not everybody can do that, right? How do you not let money and power corrupt in some way, right? And as you rightly say, we do need to make a living, and the creative community should have the right to live well.
Yes.
Right? It's a fine balance. It's a really fine balance. And there's no easy answer, right? A lot of difficult artists, for example, when they're gone, they're no longer alive, their families make a lot of decisions which the artists would have never done in their lifetime.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
You could have a whole world of museum and curatorial world who had previously found it impossible to deal with the artist.
Yes.
Right? And they can deal with the estate, or they can deal with the younger person in the family who is not so antagonistic or
attached to the work, or has,
so there are many reasons. Not everybody, so you have personalities so if you had, say, a Picasso, right? Picasso knew how to work with money. He knew how to live well. He knew how to, he knew how to have multiple wives. He knew how to be a misogynist. He knew how to play with power. He knew, he had his alliances with the Communist Party. For the longest time, he was not allowed to go to the United States. There were many other things about Picasso which we will no longer talk about, right? But he knew how to live well and spend it, right? But there's irreverence. So if we compare Sadiqian to Picasso, Picasso knew how to live well, spend, but he was irreverent. Sadiqian couldn't be bothered about spending or have a taste for any of that. He claimed that I'm not interested in that kind of embellishment, right? Then what they have in common is irreverence. And I think that's what it takes. Because money will come, should come. But if you are, if you're not constantly sucking up, right?
Yeah.
I think it keeps a good balance.
Yeah. And I think it's like that in most professions, right? I mean, making money and being good at what you do and producing a good product, in some ways, are different things. Right? In an ideal world, it all converges. But sometimes it doesn't.
No.
And many a times it doesn't, right?
Yes.
And that's a pity. So your work is a moving image based on the scans. So you were successful in scanning and making a film out of it.
Creating like an animation. With nothing to see.
With nothing to see. Okay. That's interesting. What do you mean by that? With nothing to see?
Because Sadiqian is such a if I say Sadiqian, everybody has an idea of one painting.
An image comes into your mind,
right? So, give no image that comes. And the film is a conversation between Dr. Akhund Forbes, scripted through his writings, based on the kinds of things he wrote about Sadiqian, and then Sadiqian's own writings.
It's based on Akhund Forbes' work,
And Sadiqian's own
writings.
Sadiqian's
own writings.
Own writings. And he wrote extensively.
Yes.
Which, I did not have the full grasp of the extent to which he wrote. And so he first started writing poetry when he was 17.
Okay.
And he destroyed most of it. His mom salvaged some of it and kept it in a trunk, which he rediscovers.
I see.
Right. And he's always claimed that I was constantly discouraged from, becoming a poet, because you can't become a poet at 17.
Yeah.
You need to be at least 40, he was told. Right? And so he kept selling, and he used to handwrite his own textbooks. And once he finished, he would go sell them. And then whatever money he got out of that, he would get drawing material.
I see.
Right?
Yeah.
So his attachment to the word and image is sort of interchangeable.
The way and calligraphy and the way he writes, very much that the word becomes
An
the
image.
image. Yeah.
Right? And he also says in one of his writings, right, that I could, I was just copying. I was just copying an image. People could read it, but I couldn't. And people say, oh, you've done a really, but I couldn't read it.
Yeah.
And so, and that you don't maybe understand the full finesse of a culture, which is, so you have to, if you think of the iconic, right, the iconoclast and right, so if you think of image making, and then people who say, like, don't make any images, okay, so whether it's Judaism, Islam, like, forbidden, it's forbidden to make images, and then you have people who, make icons, right, and they'll be like, we make images, so you come from the Greeks, so you have two different ways of imagining and showing the world. If you come from a culture where the word is the image, it's a completely different idea of what abstraction and an image itself is.
Yeah.
Right? So the classical sort of Renaissance, 3-dimension and likeness and, and then you have sort of Plato's warning, don't be fooled, right? Don't be fooled by mimicry, basically.
Yeah.
Or the image. So then there's a lot of, you can think of new media and you can think of images and control and, there's a whole lot of, spectacle, the problem with spectacle.
Yeah.
Right? And we can come back to social media and circulation of images and what it can do and the kind of disinformation it can,
Yeah.
And that's precisely the danger of the image, right? And then not knowing that. So I'm just saying, one can read, it just depends on where you want to make a stab, right? Which frame you're going to, what's your argument? Because an artist like Sadiq allows you the full range. You can talk about him, as a calligrapher. You can talk to him about somebody who
as
illustrated
modern
books,
artist,
as a contemporary, as a
and also as a poet.
As a poet, but he says, "मैं शायर नहीं हूँ." But then is self-deprecating. But then, so you say, "Okay, but are you?" And are you?
And there was something that he recognized that he couldn't do in art what he could achieve in poetry in terms of the range of expression.
Also the thing is, right, it's vocabularies.
Yeah.
Right? Now, poetry is what in Urdu?
Poetry is shairi.
Okay. Rubai goi in English?
Is a quartet or haiku.
Right.
Yeah.
And what does that come under?
Poetry again.
Right. And he says it's not the same thing.
It's the vocabulary. Yeah.
Right. And he claims कि मैं रुबाई गोई को शायरी तो नहीं कहता हूँ. And then he kind of makes a whole claim for why.
Yeah.
So, he says like, I write so in exactly the same way. Right? Japanese poetry, is it all poetry? Is it become something else? Ghazal likhna shairi hai, nahi hai. It just makes you think. Kalam gana hai. Devotion music.
Yeah.
And then you realize the richness of, the loss in translation is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Absolutely. And your work with the conversation aims to bring forth some of these ideas and give a different kind of understanding of Sadiq Khan than has existed before, or is
that would be a big claim.
No, but what is it trying to achieve? And I'm forgive me for asking this question, but what would you like it to achieve?
Just want it to be thought-provoking.
Okay.
Right? Like some of the things I just said. And I think one of the things Dr. Akhund does make a claim for is you do not understand Sadiqian unless you understand his cultural milieu.
Yes.
And language is very important.
And language is extremely
right?
important for
And
him.
then what's lost in this.
Yes.
Right? So I think the film is pushing at that.
Pushing at that, yeah.
Right? Whoever takes away from it, who knew how much, you can't, but it will do at least that.
Yes. At the very least. Yeah.
And the rest, you keep it open.
Of course. So can we close by asking, I'd like to close by asking you, is it fun being an artist in Pakistan?
Is it fun being an artist
and I asked this a very particular reason. I mean, there's a lot of richness of material here, it's just around you, it's everywhere, right? It's a huge history. There's, but is it fun being an artist here? And because you've been working in this, since the late 90s, and your experiences have changed. You spent some of your time in Sri Lanka. You've spent some time here. You've lived and worked in the UK. You studied there.
Yeah.
Where do you enjoy being an artist most? And is it possible to sort of confine yourself, ask that question in a geographic context?
I think it's fun being an artist where you feel there are things that make you want to respond to.
Yeah.
Right? So for me, for example, it would be no fun being an artist in, say, Switzerland. Because it would be really alien. I find it sterile for me, the kind of things that make me question things, right? But at the same time, if I had something and I required the peace and time to actually finish something, to process something to a high precision, that would work.
Yeah.
Right? So I think, but I mean, we've eroded a lot of our freedoms.
I was getting at that as well. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because even if you read old newspaper articles, the sorts of things people would write about, talk about, question, engage in.
Yes. Those questions are not being asked with the same irreverence.
To art.
To art, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You're just sort of like, oh, he's a critic, he's writing about me, Darif likho sirf, right?
Yes.
Just praise, and you cannot really be, or criticism is considered to be personal as opposed to.
Of the work and not really taken personally that way. Yeah.
And all of us actually.
Yeah, we're all guilty of that.
Because art is a reflection of this time. So if you're being critical of yourself in this, right? Or you are actively participating because you want it better, or you want it different, or you see something you hadn't seen before. But if you don't take on those sorts of responsibilities as a writer, then I don't know what you do. And all those things have really, really sort of, not only here, worldwide.
Yes.
Right? Everybody's too thin-skinned. And I don't know whether social media has exacerbated that. But perhaps it has. So you can mock people on social media, you can love people on social media. And it's just really quick because you're supposed to put a like in that many seconds, right?
Everyone's a critic.
And everybody's a critic.
Everyone is a critic.
Which is fine, but if somebody actually wears a hat of a critic, right, then at least slow it down.
Yeah.
Slow down the quick responses.
Reflect.
And if something is wonderful and it's unanimously sort of, then you show how and why.
Yeah.
Right? Because not everybody has the skill set to articulate it. तो कुछ तो करना है ना?
Yeah.
Right? It has to be just more than it
Yeah.
was wonderful and your regular kind of CV or you know what I mean. And it doesn't always have to be, oh, this person was so disadvantaged or right. So it has to be about the mind
And the work.
and the work.
Yeah.
Work, of course, but I'm just saying it has to be about the mind, the work,
The context.
the context, right? It's like a bowler, right? You're a really wonderful bowler. First the bowling,
Yes.
right? And then comes everything else.
Absolutely.
But what often happens is you get the other end of the stick. You go too much into identity, history, geography, and then you're like, okay, but there's nothing happening here.
Yeah. Maybe that will change.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be really depressing otherwise.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, Dr. Mariah Lookman, thank you so much. It's been an enlightening, pleasurable, wonderful conversation. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been fun.
Thank you.